They called it impossible. They called it madness. And yet, somehow, it became legend. This is not the story of a hero born with power, or a soldier gifted with invulnerability. This is the story of a human, the kind of human who had no right to survive, no right to fight on when every force in the universe pressed against them. And still, they refused to quit. It begins in silence. Not the silence of peace, but the silence that follows devastation. The battlefield was still smoldering, metal twisted into grotesque sculptures of war, the air thick with the acrid scent of plasma burns. Ships that once pierced the void like blades now lay broken, shattered hulls scattering across the barren surface of a forgotten moon. And somewhere in that wasteland, a human still breathed. The alien empire had crushed everything in its path. Species after species had fallen, surrendering not because they lacked numbers, but because they lacked will. Against the weight of annihilation, most beings accept inevitability. They curl into defeat. They kneel. They beg. But humans do something else. They spit blood into the dirt, grit their teeth, and rise again. That was what the Empire had never understood. On this day, the Empire thought the war was already over. They had left behind their usual survey teams to clean up, catalog, and confirm that no survivors remained. Their scanners detected nothing of significance. And yet, buried beneath the wreckage of a downed ship, pinned beneath slabs of alloy and rubble, a human soldier named Elias Kane clawed his way back to the surface. He should have been dead. By every measure of probability, he was dead. His ribs were shattered, his leg was mangled, and the burns along his back seared with every breath he took. But there it was, that same curse, that same miracle, that human refusal to die. He dragged himself forward inch by inch, leaving a trail of blood across steel and stone, until the faint light of the fractured sky broke over his dirt-streaked face. The first thing Elias heard was laughter, not human laughter. It was the harsh, clicking sound of alien soldiers. The survey team had found him. To them, this was entertainment, a wounded animal refusing to accept its end. They mocked him, speaking in their own tongue, betting on how long he would last before collapsing. To them, this was not an enemy. It was a curiosity. But Elias, broken and beaten, locked eyes with them and did something they had not expected. He smiled. A grin cracked across bloodied lips, as if to say, "You should have finished the job when you had the chance." That grin made them pause. That grin reminded them of every whispered tale their commanders had denied, of every rumor about humans that circulated across the barracks. The humans did not quit. They did not surrender. And sometimes, when cornered, they became something worse than any predator the galaxy had ever known. Elias pushed himself to his feet. It was not graceful. His leg barely held his weight, his arm trembled, and every nerve screamed for him to collapse. But he stood anyway. And in that moment, the aliens realized the difference between surviving and enduring. One is an accident. The other is a choice. The survey team opened fire. Not to kill, no. They thought it more amusing to wound. Bolts of energy seared past, grazing him, cutting into the already ruined flesh of his body. Each hit should have dropped him. Each hit should have convinced him to fall. But Elias only stumbled, only swayed, only clenched his fists tighter around the bent piece of metal he had pulled from the wreckage. A weapon? Not by any standard measure. But to a human backed against the wall, anything could become a weapon. A rock, a bone, a shard of glass, it did not matter. What mattered was intent. What mattered was the refusal to lie down. And so, when they closed in to finish the game, Elias struck. The sound of bone meeting steel rang out, sharp and final. The first alien soldier dropped. Shock rippled through the others. They had expected begging. They had expected fear. What they found was fury, wrapped in a human body that had no business still standing. Elias turned on them with a ferocity that defied his injuries, lashing out with every ounce of strength that still burned in his muscles. It was not a clean fight. It was not a cinematic display of martial perfection. It was raw, brutal, desperate. But desperation is its own weapon. Humans, when pushed beyond their limits, do not break. They become chaos incarnate. And chaos is something no soldier can ever truly prepare for. By the time the last of them fell, Elias was barely conscious. His weapon slipped from bloodied hands. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, his vision swimming in and out of focus. He had done it. He had survived the first round. But the war was far from over, because beyond the ridge, more were coming. The sound of armored boots thundered across the barren ground. Reinforcements. Elias looked to the sky. Smoke and fire still curled into the void above, glowing red against the stars. He whispered a single word, whether to himself, to his fallen comrades, or to the universe itself. No one could say. Not yet. That was the essence of humanity. Not victory, not dominance, not superiority, just defiance. The refusal to end when logic demanded it. The choice to rise one more time, no matter how many times they had fallen. And it was that choice, that cursed miracle, that terrified the galaxy more than any weapon ever could. Elias dragged himself behind the jagged ruins of a fallen gunship, forcing his lungs to pull in air, despite the agony. His mind raced not with despair, but with calculation. He did not need to win. He did not even need to live much longer. He just needed to hold on, to fight for one more moment, to make the enemy fear the name of humanity again. Because if even a single human could force 1,000 to remember fear, then humanity as a whole would never truly be conquered. And that, right there, is where the survival story begins. The alien reinforcements arrived with discipline and precision. Their formation was flawless, their weapons gleaming with plasma energy, their armor shining in the dull glow of the battlefield fires. To them, the sight of one wounded human leaning against the wreckage of a ruined ship was laughable. They saw a target, not a threat. Their commander stepped forward, voice carrying with authority. In their language, guttural and sharp, he barked an order to capture the human alive. This was no longer a battle. It was a curiosity. They had all heard the whispers about humans, the stories told in hushed tones in military academies across the empire. But stories were just that, stories. Legends to frighten young soldiers into obedience. Now they wanted proof. Proof that humans were nothing more than fragile animals pretending to be predators. Elias Kane's chest rose and fell with shallow, ragged breaths. Blood stained his torn uniform. Dirt clung to his skin, and his vision blurred. But behind those eyes was something dangerous resolve. He was battered, yes, but not broken. And that distinction mattered more than anything else. Because the moment you convince yourself you are not broken, you become capable of things that should be impossible. As the alien soldiers advanced, Elias tightened his grip on the jagged metal shard he carried. His fingers trembled, but his spirit did not. He whispered to himself, over and over, 3 words that had carried humans through every impossible trial across their history. Do not quit. The aliens did not expect resistance. They moved without caution, their rifles lowered, confident in their superiority. That confidence was their mistake. When the first soldier reached to seize him, Elias drove the shard upward, catching the alien beneath its armor plating. A cry of shock rang out, the soldier stumbling backward. In the chaos, Elias grabbed the fallen alien's weapon, turning it against them with desperate ferocity. Energy bolts cracked across the battlefield, searing the night. He fired wildly, not with precision, but with fury. Aliens scattered, taking cover behind the wreckage they had thought would protect them. In that moment, they realized what every empire learns: too late. Humans fight like cornered animals. And cornered animals are the most dangerous of all. But Elias knew he could not outgun them. His body screamed with every movement, his strength fading. So he relied on something else, the human mind, adaptation, improvisation, the very traits the Empire had dismissed as chaos, but which, in truth, were survival itself. He retreated deeper into the wreckage, setting crude traps as he moved. Sharp fragments of hull plating positioned to fall. Explosives salvaged from broken munitions, rewired with shaky hands. He used the battlefield itself as his ally, every broken piece of technology becoming a weapon in his hands. The aliens pursued, but each step cost them. A tripwire detonated. A plasma charge ripped through their ranks. Panic spread, subtle but growing. Still, they pressed on. After all, he was one man, and they were many. Logic demanded that numbers would win. But Elias understood something that numbers could never erase. Fear spreads faster than fire. The more resistance he offered, the more the soldiers hesitated. And hesitation is death on any battlefield. Hours passed in brutal, desperate combat. Elias fought in bursts, striking when the enemy closed in, then vanishing deeper into the labyrinth of wreckage. Each time they thought they had cornered him, he slipped through, leading bodies in his wake. His strength should have failed him long ago. His body should have collapsed. But still, he moved. Still, he fought. Because to him, quitting was not an option. News of the resistance spread up the chain of command. What had begun as a simple survey operation now became an embarrassment. The alien commander, furious at the delays and losses, demanded an explanation. His officers hesitated to speak the truth, but eventually it came out. "It is the human, my lord. He refuses to die." That phrase sent chills through the command tent. The commander narrowed his eyes. He had studied humans in theory, heard the whispers. But hearing them and facing them were different things. To hear that a single wounded soldier was defying an entire unit was not just shameful, it was dangerous. It was contagious. Because defiance inspires. And if even one human could stand alone and make the Empire hesitate, what would happen if others followed that example? What would happen if entire battalions carried the same fire? Empires are not built on numbers alone. They are built on fear. If fear cracks, the Empire crumbles. Elias Kane knew none of this. He did not know that his defiance was spreading whispers among the enemy ranks. He did not know that alien soldiers were beginning to question the orders they had once accepted without doubt. All he knew was that his body ached, his wounds bled, and yet, somehow, he was still alive. Still breathing. Still fighting. Night fell across the battlefield, the alien moon casting its pale light over the ruins. Elias crouched inside the hollow of a broken transport, clutching his stolen weapon. His body trembled, but his mind burned like fire. He thought of Earth, of home, of the people who depended on soldiers like him to hold the line, to remind the galaxy that humanity would never kneel. He whispered into the silence, his voice hoarse but steady. "You will not break us." The aliens launched their final push before dawn. A full company, armored and armed, advancing in unison. The ground shook beneath their march, their weapons glowing with lethal energy. This time, they would not toy with him. This time, they came to kill. Elias stood to meet them, alone, one human against an army. His body was broken, but his spirit towered higher than any empire. He raised his weapon, aimed at the advancing tide, and pulled the trigger. The first line fell. The second faltered. Chaos rippled through the ranks. And still, he fought. Each shot, each strike, each desperate act of defiance was a message carved into the stars themselves. Humans do not quit. The aliens began to break. Their discipline fractured. What had begun as an assured victory now became a nightmare. The legend of Elias Kane was born not from victory, but from endurance, from the refusal to fall, from the lesson that no matter how many times you push humanity down, we rise again. When the sun rose over the battlefield, the ground was littered with the fallen. Smoke curled into the sky, and somewhere amid the ruins, Elias Kane still stood barely, but undeniably. His body would not last much longer. His wounds were too great, his blood too freely spilled. But his story had already achieved what his body never could. The aliens retreated, not because they were defeated in numbers, but because they were defeated in spirit. They had faced a human who should have quit, who should have died, and yet had not. And that terrified them more than any weapon. Elias collapsed to his knees, his vision fading. But before unconsciousness claimed him, he allowed himself one final smile. Because he knew the truth now. The Empire could break ships, they could shatter armies, they could burn worlds. But they could never extinguish the one thing that made humans invincible, the refusal to surrender, and that refusal would echo across the stars. The battlefield lay quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that does not bring peace, but unease. The alien company had withdrawn, their dead left behind, their pride shattered. Smoke curled lazily into the pale light of morning, and in the wreckage, Elias Kane still breathed, barely. His body was a ruin, his wounds deep, his strength almost gone, but his spirit was unbroken. That was enough. News of the encounter spread faster than fire. What should have been a footnote in the Empire's campaign became a whispered story in every barracks, every transport ship, every outpost across the sector. A single human soldier, broken and outnumbered, had resisted an entire company. Not for minutes, not for an hour, but for the span of an entire night. Soldiers told the tale in disbelief. Some laughed, calling it an exaggeration, a soldier's tale stretched too far. But others, those who had seen the battlefield with their own eyes, spoke with a different tone, a tone that carried fear. The Empire tried to silence it. Reports were classified. Survivors were ordered not to speak. But words are slippery things. They find cracks. They escape through whispers, passed along in dimly lit corridors, exchanged over shared drinks, murmured between weary soldiers preparing for their next deployment. And the words always carried the same weight. The human refused to quit. That refusal spread beyond the soldiers to the higher councils. Generals pored over the reports with cold unease. How had one human, gravely injured, managed to inflict such chaos? Was it strategy, instinct, or something deeper? Something not accounted for in their cold, logical assessment of species across the galaxy? The Galactic Council had always viewed humans as unpredictable. Primitive, yes, but dangerous. They thrived in environments that killed others. They adapted with reckless speed. They wielded emotions like weapons, emotions that could not be quantified or predicted. And now here was living proof that humans possessed something more dangerous than technology or numbers. They possessed endurance. One counselor, an elder of a species older than humanity's written history, spoke in a hushed chamber. Strength breaks. Will endures. That is why they must be watched. But even as the council debated, the story of Elias Kane grew. Among humans, he became a symbol of defiance. Among aliens, he became a nightmare. His name was whispered in the same breath as curses, warnings, and half-believed myths. And while Elias himself lay hidden among the ruins, clinging to life by the thinnest thread, the legend had already taken on a life of its own. On the second night, scavengers descended upon the battlefield. Not soldiers, but creatures that fed on the aftermath of war. They crawled from the shadows, claws scraping metal, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They smelled blood. They smelled weakness. and they moved toward Elias. He awoke to the sound of them, low growls, the crunch of bones beneath their limbs, the whisper of claws dragging across the hull of broken ships. His body screamed at him to stay down. His vision swam with fever and blood loss. But still, he forced himself up. His hand closed around the alien rifle, lying beside him. The first scavenger lunged. Elias fired. The blast echoed across the wreckage, searing light cutting the dark. More came, drawn by the noise, by the scent. He fought them in a haze, half-conscious, his movements clumsy and desperate. Yet he did not yield. Each time he thought he would fall, he found something inside, something raw and feral, that pushed him one step further. When the last scavenger lay still, Elias collapsed once more. His body was shredded, his uniform soaked in blood. But he was alive. Still alive. And that was enough. The following day, a patrol ship circled overhead. Alien voices crackled through the combs, searching for signs of survivors. Elias remained silent, hiding beneath twisted steel, listening as the voices grew distant. He could not fight them now. Not yet. But he knew he would, if it came to it. Because he had not come this far to die quietly. By the third day, the Empire's high command could no longer ignore the reports. An entire company lost to a single human was not just a failure, it was a humiliation. Whispers among their own soldiers threatened discipline. Fear was corrosive, and it was spreading fast. So they did what empires always do when fear takes root. They turned to propaganda. Official broadcasts declared the reports false. They called Elias Kane a fabrication, a story invented to cover incompetence. They painted humans as weak, frail, and reckless. But the more they denied it, the stronger the whispers grew. Soldiers trusted the words of their comrades more than the polished lies of their leaders. And the truth was simple. They had seen a human refuse to die. Meanwhile, Elias clung to life. He found water dripping from the wreckage, scavenged ration packs from fallen soldiers, and bound his wounds with torn scraps of cloth. Infection spread through his body, fever burned his mind, but his will carried him forward. He was not fighting for victory anymore. He was fighting for survival, for the chance to prove that humans never quit. At night, he dreamed of Earth. He saw the blue oceans, the green forests, the laughter of children playing in streets untouched by war. Those dreams were what kept him alive. Each time his body begged for surrender, he thought of home. He thought of the people who had no idea he was out here, bleeding in the dirt, standing against the impossible. And he told himself, I will not fail them. By the end of the week, rescue finally came, but not from his own. A neutral species, traveling traders who skirted the edges of war zones, stumbled upon the ruins. They found Elias barely conscious, delirious with fever, clutching a weapon he no longer had the strength to lift. They should have left him. It would have been safer. But something in his eyes, even clouded by pain, made them hesitate. Something told them that this human was more than just a soldier. He was a message. They carried him aboard their vessel, patched his wounds, and listened as he whispered fragments of his ordeal. They did not understand all the words, but they understood the meaning. Do not quit. Within weeks, the story had spread beyond the Empire's control. It reached colonies, outposts, and even rival empires. Everywhere it traveled, it grew, twisted, and transformed, but the core remained the same. A single human had stood alone against impossible odds, and he had endured. And so, Elias Kane, the soldier who should have died 100 times over, became more than a man. He became a legend that would haunt the Empire, inspire the oppressed, and remind the galaxy of one undeniable truth: humans never quit. The story of Elias Kane spread like wildfire, but legends are dangerous things. For the Galactic Empire, it was not just a tale, it was a contagion. A sickness of morale, spreading through their armies, whispering into the minds of their soldiers. If one human could endure against impossible odds, what did that mean for the millions more scattered across the stars? At first, the Empire tried to smother the tale, branding it a fabrication, a human propaganda stunt. But the harder they pushed, the more cracks appeared in their facade. Soldiers at the front whispered, "I heard from a friend, who heard from a survivor." Merchants carried the tale from system to system. Smugglers etched it into songs sung in shadowy cantinas. Even neutral species, who had no stake in the war, began to speak of the human who would not die. It was no longer about Elias himself. He had become a symbol, and symbols are far more dangerous than soldiers. The turning point. Elias Kane's recovery aboard the trader ship was slow, brutal, and uncertain. The fever clung to him for weeks, clawing at his body, dragging him toward the edge of death. Many nights the crew expected him not to wake, but he always did. No matter how high the fever, no matter how deep the pain, his eyes always opened again. One of the traders, a quiet elder of a reptilian species, finally asked him, "Why do you fight so hard to live? You could surrender. You could let go." Elias rasped his answer, every word costing him effort, because humans don't quit, even when we should, especially when we should. That answer unsettled them more than any wound. They had seen countless warriors before, brave, disciplined, noble. But this was something different. It was not bravery. It was defiance against nature itself. When Elias finally stood again, weeks later, he was not the same man who had fought in the dirt and blood of that battlefield. His body bore scars that would never heal, but his spirit burned hotter than ever. He had seen the edge of death and spat in its face, and when he looked into the stars, he did not see emptiness. He saw opportunity. The Empire's fear back in the council chambers of the Empire. Panic festered beneath polished words and rigid ceremony. Reports of unrest among their soldiers mounted daily. Whole platoons hesitated when faced with human opponents. Whispers of Elias Kane were muttered before battles, the soldiers clutching their weapons a little tighter, their eyes darting nervously. An empire thrives on fear, but never fear of the enemy. Fear of humans, however, was something new. One general slammed a clawed fist upon the table during a heated session. "We are not fighting humans," he growled. "We are fighting something else. Something irrational. Something that does not belong in the natural order." Another countered, "No, we are fighting an idea. The human himself is irrelevant. It is the story that wounds us." And they were both right. What terrified the Empire was not Elias Kane as a man. It was what he represented, a species that would not yield, would not surrender, would not accept defeat even when crushed and broken. Against such an enemy, numbers meant little. Technology meant little. Logic itself failed, because humans, by their very nature, were chaos. Humanity awakens. Meanwhile, the story of Elias Kane did not just spread fear, it inspired. Human colonies across the stars rallied around his name. Soldiers painted his likeness on armor. Civilians whispered his story as bedtime tales for their children. He became a living myth, proof that humans were more than just survivors. They were fighters. And humans, when united by a story, are dangerous. Soon, Elias's ordeal became a rallying cry. Human forces, scattered and fragmented, began to coordinate. They moved with renewed vigor, not because they had new weapons or ships, but because they had belief that no matter how dire the odds, no matter how overwhelming the enemy, humanity's greatest strength was simple. They never quit. The Council's mistake, the Galactic Council, already weary of humanity's unpredictable nature, made a fateful choice. They declared humans too dangerous, too destabilizing. too uncontrollable to be allowed free rein in the galaxy. And so, they passed a decree. Humanity was to be contained, isolated, and if necessary erased. It was their greatest mistake, because nothing fuels human stubbornness more than being told, you cannot. The moment the decree was made, humanity did not cower. They did not beg for mercy. They stood taller. They fought harder. They dug their heels into the ground and said the words that have echoed across every battlefield, every rebellion, every hopeless struggle throughout their history. Try and stop us. The human spirit Elias Kane returned to his people a shadow of the man he once was, but also more than he had ever been. When he stepped onto the deck of a human warship, the soldiers saluted not the scars on his body, but the fire in his eyes. He was no longer just a soldier. He was proof of what they all were. He spoke to them not with grand speeches, but with the raw truth. They will outnumber us. They will outgun us. They will break our bones and burn our worlds. But they cannot make us quit. And as long as we do not quit, we cannot lose. Those words became a creed. Humanity fought back with renewed ferocity. Every loss was met with stubborn retaliation. Every retreat became a trap. Every apparent surrender was just another setup for a counterstrike. They fought dirty. They fought clever. They fought like only humans could, with chaos, with passion, with sheer refusal to die quietly. And slowly, impossibly, the empire began to break. The truth they could not kill in the end. It did not matter if Elias Kane lived or died, because the story had already outgrown him. The truth was not in the details, it was in the spirit. A single human, outnumbered and broken, had refused to quit. That was enough to terrify an empire. That was enough to awaken a species. And that is why humans are feared. Not because of their weapons, not because of their technology, not even because of their numbers, but because they are monsters of willpower. Because when others surrender to despair, humans fight. When logic says impossible, humans whisper back, watch us. Because humanity's greatest weapon has never been steel or fire. It has always been refusal. Refusal to bow. Refusal to surrender. Refusal to quit. And that refusal is why, against all odds, humanity survives. Closing words. The galaxy never forgot Elias Kane. His story lived on. Not in statues or monuments, but in the fire of human hearts, in the whispered fear of alien councils. He became a reminder that you cannot kill an idea born of defiance, because in the end, humanity is not defined by its fragility, or its flaws, or its mortality. Humanity is defined by this. Even when the universe itself demands their end, humans simply smile, clench their fists, and keep going, because humans never quit.